Welcome, everybody. I'm very, very happy to announce that we're going to be doing something very interesting. Ed Lozansky contacted me some weeks back with this idea that we should make certain discussions that are verboten more normalized. And obviously, the role of citizen activism, but as well as policy discussions that affect policymakers that pertain to solutions is extremely important, and not just solutions to the existential crises threatening humanity as a whole, but also a diagnostic of how we got here. So what were the reasons mechanically and otherwise that brought us into this current moment of crisis, with the idea that if we can appreciate the historical currents in better detail, bringing on various experts who have really proven themselves to have insight into these matters, we will be able to better navigate through the minefield that we currently find ourselves in here at this historic moment where there is a systemic breakdown that we are living through. It is not the consequence of something that happened last week, last month, or even over the last few years. This is a generational process of buildup that is resulting now in a high degree of potential for great good or great evil. Either way, it's very underdetermined. So I'm very, very happy that Ed asked me to moderate and facilitate some of this discussion. Today, Ed, as well as Peter Kuznick, as well as Professor Gardner, will be the main speakers. Every 2 weeks, we're going to have a different rotation. Some people will come back to deliver their considerations. Every couple of weeks, we'll have new people coming through, and hopefully this dialogue is going to be something which really gives us insights into what to do in this current crisis. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Ed Lozansky. He's been a friend, a collaborator now for a number of years, and somebody who has really been on the front lines of world history over many decades as a champion of peace, somebody who's been working to build bridges instead of burning them down between East and West, Russia and the United States, but even more broadly, hosting conferences, hundreds of conferences over the course of his career as a political activist, a scientist, and somebody who is really thinking on, I think, a very constructive level. So I'm very, very pleased that Ed asked me to do this. And Ed, it is all yours.
Okay. I see some people are still in the waiting room, so while I speak, just let them in.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. And to thank you all of you who joined for this discussion, especially those times when almost every day we hear the news that another step towards World War III, some say nuclear World War III, and no one knows how to end this crisis. And it's almost Senator, I recall Senator Sam Nunn, even 2 years ago, even 3 years ago, I think, he predicted this. He said we're sleepwalking into nuclear catastrophe. So Senator Nunn, of course, had geostrategic vision, and I think also Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz, U.S. Secretary of Energy, sleepwalking. And I think this sleepwalking now it's more kind of accelerating. So the question is, we just sit and wait until this Armageddon, or try to do something as what we call people's diplomacy, and see, well, maybe we'll come up with some ideas. I will start with a very brief introduction of university, simply so people who see me or hear me first time understand that this was not just a bunch of some kind of activists who decided suddenly to open American University in Moscow. And this happened when it was still USSR. Can you imagine? USSR, Soviet Union, one-party system, America is enemy, Cold War, and suddenly Moscow wants to open American University in Moscow. I repeat, Moscow wanted. Moscow started this. So let's quickly show you some slides to show the history of this event. Okay, go ahead, Pete. We can meet. Okay, this is the first. We're talking about 1990. 1990. Actually, I'm sorry, 89, right? So 35 years. Today, now it's 35 years ago. And people here, I will show you, it's who is who in the Soviet Academy of Science and educational system. President of Soviet Academy of Science, Mr. Marchuk, President of Moscow State University, Logunov, Vice President Yuri Osipyan, who actually was the driving force. And this, pay attention to this man on the left. On the left, it's a representative of American embassy. He came also to hear what we have in mind, and he was very supportive. His name is John Katska, and I'll maybe mention later a little bit about him because he recently wrote an article in American Diplomacy magazine and completely different views that he expressed at that time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is a letter from no one else but Vice President, on the letterhead of the White House, Vice President Dan Quayle, because George Bush liked this idea, and he appointed his vice president assignment to oversee this project. I'm not going to read the whole thing, only last paragraph to understand what White House, well, and this date is September 19, 1990. And this is what, on behalf of President Bush, Dan Quayle, I congratulated the students of what we hope will become a full-scale private American university in the Soviet Union. You are embarking on an exciting voyage of discovery, just as exploration of the new world set off rapid progress and development in Western Europe 4 centuries ago. It is our hope that your own encounter within the new world will provide equally stimulating. Please accept my and President's best wishes. This is on the White House letterhead. This is how it's all started. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is Vice President Dan Quayle. Not only sent this letter, he went to Moscow and he met President Gorbachev. You see this meeting, and then we discussed this and some other projects that by the time we were talking about, not just American University, many others. Okay, next, please. Okay, this is very interesting. This is Russian Academy of Science, and Vice President Dan Quayle, again, you can see him in the center, and in the middle, next to him is Gennady Osipov, who was president of one of the research institutes, social sciences, who organized this meeting. You see American flag, a Russian flag. Well, I'm next to Osipov, and we talked again. You see maybe this poster in front, it says American University in Moscow. So this was how it was presented as an idea. Okay, next, please. Okay, this is, now we've been back to Washington, and this is a meeting in the American Academy in Science, and we have a reception to discuss this project. It was attended by many, many members of not only Academy, but actually people from State Department, from Congress. There was a reception after that, but it took place also in Moscow, 1990, in Washington Academy of Sciences. It looks very legitimate organization. Next, please. Okay, this is our first project. Before we even started classes, we decided to, Soviet Union was really in bad shape. Bad shape, economy was crumbling, people not paid salaries. It just was a horrible thing. So then Russia was kind of maybe with extended hand asking for help. And I had an idea that maybe we should find something that Soviet Union can give, not only take, not only beg for help, but give. An educational system at this time was, and I think still is, especially in medicine science, was really terrific. And this magazine, Quantum, it's called Student Magazine of Medicine Science. This was our first joint project. It was funded by American National Science Foundation, but content was mostly from Soviet scientists. And then they presented articles in such a way that students, even in high schools, and of course universities, can understand most really important issues of science at that time. And this magazine was later picked up by Springer, and for many years, Springer published this magazine. But this was our first project. It's also an educational project called Quantum. Okay, keep going. Now, for university, you need building. So Mayor of Moscow was called, Gorbachev called Mayor of Moscow and said, provide those guys building. So Mayor of Moscow, at the time, his name was Gavril Popov. He had enormous power. And at the time, Communist Party already was on the run. So many buildings which belonged to Communist Party, and they had really best mansions, they became almost empty. So Popov, it was very easy for him to give us not just one, but two buildings. And this is one of them. And this is downtown Moscow. And this is supposed to be a building for American University. But idea was that Soviet Moscow will provide space, real estate, and America will provide money to pay salaries to professors, and other related expenses. Keep going. Okay, this is another mention, and it was used for our office. It's downtown Moscow, one of the best really locations. You see the American and Russian flags. You see, in downtown 1990, and Soviet Union allows to display American flag in downtown. And this was our office, but we really wrote some materials for lectures, but not only lectures, we had some other ideas. So keep going. Yeah, before, since for this building to operate, we needed money, which was promised by United States. And in the meantime, since this money was kind of slow in coming, then Moscow State University provided us space. And this was location that we used for America. It's Moscow State University, but we used it for our office until we were waiting for money to come from US that we can move to our new building, separate building. In the meantime, we used building an office on the 10th floor here, and we had already classes. We had American professors who would come and give lectures, but it was still on small scale. Everyone was waiting for big money to come in. Let's go on. Yeah, this is another university. It's, by the way, my alma mater. This is the Nuclear Research University, which also provided space for classes. Again, still anticipating funds coming from the US. Okay, and this was office in Washington, D.C., where we plan to have American students. So it's not only just American professors teach Russian students about freedom, democracy, and other good things, but also Soviet scientists, especially in math and science, we already talked about this, they would provide good lectures on small scale, but until, still very prestigious. You see, again, American and Russian flags, downtown Washington. It's DuPont Circle area. So we had, this is 1990. So imagine two flags flying in two capitals in the downtown locations. Okay, that's it. Okay, this is our students. By the way, these students at Nuclear Research University, and they are now hearing lecture from American professor online. So this is how now audience. It was real audience, and I think it was professor from Stanford University was giving lecture online to students at Nuclear Research University. Okay, keep going. Okay, this is, by the way, it's a mixed group of Stanford University and Nuclear Research. And they met in Moscow. They met also at Stanford. And the guy who facilitated this was no one else but the former head of the Los Alamos lab, Victor Hecker. Victor Hecker was director of Los Alamos lab. So imagine Los Alamos lab, which developed atomic weapons, and nuclear university, which scientists work on nuclear weapons. And here, students from both universities, they meet. I think this was in Moscow or maybe no, this is Stanford. Stanford. Okay, and there was another, yeah. And then we talk about not just education. We had a great partners in U.S. Congress, and the Congress was Congressman Kurt Weldon, Dana Rohrabacher, and many others who thought that now that Soviet Union no more, and the Soviet Union already, no, and Russia is not promoting communism around the world, we have to start U.S.-Russia partnership and call it New Time, New Beginning. And this document, it's still available. You can easily find it on the web. Actually, we have it on our site. It disclosed many areas where Russia and America can work together for mutual benefit. And this book is in 2 languages, and it was presented to President Bush and President Putin, by the way. Putin, when he came in 2001 to Washington, we presented him this book as well. But it lists all different areas. I think next slide will show you what kind of areas we're talking. Yeah, this, by the way, this is how many members of Congress. Total number of signatures was 150. 150 members of Congress endorsed this project. And this letter to President Bush explaining what we are aiming with, that this is what we have to work together. And Kurt Weldon is, his signature is on the right, first one. You wouldn't believe it, but 6 signatures on the left. First one is Joe Biden. Joe Biden at that time, this is what day it is? 2001. Okay, 2001. It's I think I wrote an article saying that it's the only thing that Biden was right. This is when he signed this letter saying that Russia and US should work together. Total number of signatures here was over 150. Please go on. Next. Okay, here's a slide which shows all those different areas where we can work together. Space, science, technology, business, arms control, counterterrorism, cyber, all those areas that we can work together. And this was in 2001. We had, of course, break. By the way, I forgot to mention that no money ever came from US. Because when George Bush lost elections in 1992, Clinton administration was no longer interested in this project. We continued using some private contributions, but no help from US government, which was promised, but never materialized. So that's why we continued to stay at Moscow State and Nuclear Research University. American professors kept teaching all that, but it was online and mainly in small offices, not something big that we really planned. But this shows how we were close to that. Okay, and this is something to show the spirit. Like we talk about not just practical things. It also has to be like spirit, and spirit that we kind of all of us were enjoying was spirit of the Elbe. It's example how our countries can put aside difference, build trust, cooperation, and this is what soldiers in April 25, 1945, the mix of American and Russians, and they were really spirit of camaraderie, friendship, and this is we thought that maybe something that will help two countries, be friends like they were. By the way, in the old days, Abraham Lincoln, all American history, Russia and America were not just friends, they were allies. Actually, like in World War II. Yeah. Okay, by the way, this is downtown Moscow. Downtown Moscow, and we have 2 statues here. One on the right is Abraham Lincoln and Russian Tsar Alexander II. They, of course, never met at the time. It was not so easy to get from one country, but this is symbolic because Lincoln was very grateful to Russian Tsar for help during the American Civil War. And this is a statue in downtown Moscow. And on the left, this is the same, what I mentioned, Elbe spirit, this meeting of Soviet and American soldiers on the Elbe River in Germany. in 1945, and people come, bring flowers, and this is downtown Moscow. We call it American Square. Of course, it's an unofficial name, but it's every year the ceremonies with two flags, American and Russian flags, and we bring flowers and plant trees and all that. And this is, if you visit Moscow, you can easily find it because it's one of the most prestigious locations near Arbat Street. Okay, next. That's it, right? No, okay. By the way, this is a ceremony. This is a ceremony of the opening. It's important because at this ceremony, we had three American generals, American military attachés. One was current at the time, General Bruce McClinton, and two in the civil, former defense attachés. They're opening this monument. Well, it's not really a monument, it's a sculpture. And on the right, it's a Russian famous cosmonaut, or in America, it's astronaut, Leonov, the same guy who was commander of Soyuz Apollo flight in 1995. The Soviet and Americans had joint flight, and this was Soyuz Apollo, so Leonov was commander on the Russian side. That's it, right? Yeah.
That's it. Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you. And so it's just a brief historical introduction. Now let's go to present time. And we have my great colleague. I say colleague because I had the honor to teach at American University as well. I taught mathematics and physics, and Peter is teaching history. And not only that, he's head of the Nuclear Institute. Well, he'll probably tell you more. But I sent you his bio, so you know we not waste time for introductions. Peter, it's your floor.
Thank you, Matt and Ed, for putting this together, and Ed for all your indefatigable efforts over decades to try to bring Americans and Russians together peacefully. I'm going to do something that I don't like to do. I'm going to put up my talk on the screen and read it just for the sake of brevity, because there's so much to say and so little time. But every time I give a talk or interview, I find myself emphasizing how much more dangerous the world has become since my last talk or interview about world affairs, even though I might have just given it the day before. The world is on a mad downward cycle that will almost inevitably end with a third world war unless we can interject some sanity and rationality into global policymaking. And we do have time to change course. But war is on the agenda everywhere, and diplomacy has become a dirty word that one dare not utter in proper company without being dismissed as a traitor or a useful idiot. Narendra Modi, on his recent visit to Moscow, reiterated what he's been saying for the past couple of years, that this is not a time for war, or this is not an era of war. But if one looks around the world, the reality on the ground contradicts his wise warnings. He told Putin in Moscow a couple months ago, I know that war cannot solve problems, solutions, and peace talks can't succeed among bombs, guns, and bullets, and we need to find a way to peace through dialogue. Unfortunately, those on all sides of the Ukraine conflict have not gotten that message, nor have key leaders in the Middle East, nor have those who are planning for war in the Pacific, whether that's around the South China Sea or Taiwan or North Korea. The bullet atomic scientists first moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 90 seconds before midnight, the closest it's ever been, in January 2023. That's 10 seconds closer than it was in January 2020. It remained at 90 seconds this past January. That means that they think the world of today is only marginally more dangerous than it was in 2020, despite the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, either of which can explode into global conflagrations. Actually, the Ukraine war has already become a global proxy war. The Pacific has been militarized to an unprecedented extent, and Air Force General Mike Minihan predicts that the U.S. and China will be at war by 2025. And arms control talks have completely broken down, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. Not only are all 9 nuclear powers modernizing their arsenals to become more effective, more lethal, and more usable, most have already begun or are planning to reverse decades of progress in reducing arsenals and intend to expand them, in some cases dramatically. So we live in a very precarious moment in history. The lunatics have taken over the asylums, and much of the world is, as Ed said, sleepwalking blindly, though inexorably, toward Armageddon. In his brilliant, though profoundly pessimistic 1929 book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud posits the existence of a human death instinct. Freud, like many leading intellectuals, was deeply demoralized by the unprecedented carnage of World War I, a war in which France lost half of its young men between the ages of 15 and 30, and the toll of dead Russians was even greater. For Freud, this was essentially a rejection of his early, more positive view of human nature. But Freud's concerns about the dark side of human nature were borne out by the greater nightmare of the Second World War, including the 60 to 80 million dead, the horrifying deaths of millions in the Holocaust, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I've written about extensively, and not only denounced for the absolutely unnecessary killing of hundreds of thousands of Japanese women and children, but for knowingly putting the world on the glide path toward annihilation. As Truman said when he got the full report on the power of the bomb test at Alamogordo, New Mexico, he wrote in his journal, "This may be the fire of destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. Not a more powerful bomb, but the absolute end of life on the planet." And we live with that sword of Damocles hanging over us ever since. Humanity had never before confronted destruction on the scale of the Second World War. The Soviets lost 27 million dead to the Nazis. China lost at least half that many to the Japanese. Many of Europe's and Asia's major cities have been bombed and lay in rubble, and now nuclear annihilation beckoned. But instead of recoiling from the horrors and finding a way to live together in peace and prosperity, the world plunged into the Cold War. It's hard for today's students to imagine how dangerous that period was. But U.S. historian and presidential advisor Arthur Schlesinger described it most aptly when he said men and women a century from now will very likely find the Cold War as obscure and incomprehensible as we today find the 30 Years' War, the terrible conflict that devastated much of Europe not too long ago. Looking back at the 20th century, our descendants will very likely be astonished at the disproportion between the causes of the Cold War, which may well seem trivial, and the consequences, which could have meant the veritable end of history. If we survive the current global crisis, 50 or 75 years from now, some astute future historian will comment similarly about our era and the disproportion between the causes and the potential consequences. So let's explore the current situation in more depth. In late June, Ivana Hughes and I co-authored an article titled "Prolonging the Ukraine War is Flirting with Nuclear Disaster." Ivana teaches chemistry at Columbia and heads the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. We warned then that the Ukraine war had turned into a proxy war between Russia and NATO, led by the United States. With the U.S. in the forefront, NATO is providing Zelensky with the arms and financing needed to keep Ukraine in the war and training intelligence to counter Russia's advances. The fact that the West was providing more and more advanced weapon systems and giving Ukraine permission to strike targets inside Russia had taken the war to a new, more precarious level. While neither Professor Hughes nor I believed that Russia was justified in invading Ukraine in February 2022, we both rejected the Western claim that the invasion was unprovoked. Not only did the West provoke Russia, but Western leaders have been doing so for decades with NATO expansion and heavy-handed political interference into Ukraine's affairs in order to remove it from Russia's orbit. as Zbigniew Brzezinski and the neocons had advocated. Still, the invasion could have been prevented had Western leaders been serious about the Minsk agreements that they, Russia and Ukraine, negotiated, and the invasion could then have been ended very quickly had the US and Britain not sabotaged the Turkish Accords that both Russia and Ukraine had been ready to approve in March of 2022. So there's plenty of blame to go around for the slaughter in Ukraine. But the dangerous situation that Professor Hughes and I described has gotten markedly worse since we wrote in late June. The US and its NATO partners have subsequently delivered F-16 fighter jets and more ATACMS missiles and leaked that joint air-to-surface standoff missiles, or JASSMs, will likely soon follow. These stealthy cruise missiles can strike deep enough into Russia to hit targets in Crimea and reach the outskirts of Moscow, not with drones that carry 5 to 10 pounds of explosives, but with 1,000-pound warheads, putting at least 30 Russian air bases within range. There is also a longer-range JASSM that could hit up to 500 miles inside Russia. While final approval has not yet been given, Reuters and other sources say that such approval is imminent. One senior Ukrainian advisor told Politico, quote, "There's some indication now that Biden might want to do something big on Ukraine, maybe lifting some of the restrictions before the election now that he's not running. There's no guarantee, but we're hearing that he's thinking about it." Thus, NATO policy is based on three dangerous illusions. First, that Ukraine can defeat Russia if given enough military and financial aid, driving Russian forces out of all Ukrainian territory. Second, that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, it will go on to gobble up one piece of Europe after another. And third, that Russia has no red lines that need to be taken into consideration by Ukrainian forces and their NATO backers. First, given Russia's advantages in manpower and weaponry and its improved military strategy, it is winning the war on the ground and will continue to do so. Without direct intervention of NATO troops, which Macron has encouraged, but Biden thus far nixed, Ukraine has no chance of winning. The Western mantra that Ukraine is just the appetizer and that after that, Putin will go after one European country after another is too preposterous to even take seriously. Whatever one might think of Putin, he is not a fool or a madman. Given Russia's difficulty in defeating Ukraine, does it make sense that he would want to take on NATO? And the no red lines idea is a reckless gamble that has evolved incrementally. In 2008, U.S. Ambassador to Russia William Burns, the current CIA director, wrote a memo to the White House titled "Niet means Niet." Don't cross Russia's red lines when it comes to inviting Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. The U.S. ignored his warning, and we see how well that worked out. In 2022, Putin made nuclear threats the first day of the invasion and has repeated them several times since. He said, in the event of a threat to the territorial integrity of our country and to defend Russia and our people, we will certainly make use of all weapon systems available to us. This is not a bluff. Whoever tries to hinder us, and even more so, to create threats to our country and to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate, and it will lead you to such consequences you have never encountered in your history. Biden took the threat seriously enough that he delayed delivery of one weapon system after another, fearing that each addition might provoke Russia into using its tactical nuclear weapons. But as each delivery failed to provoke a more forceful Russian response, NATO became emboldened, and the idea that Putin's threats were simply bluster took hold. No one has been expressing this more full-throatedly than Zelensky himself, and NATO seems to be convinced he's right. David Sanger's August 20th article in the New York Times sent shivers down the spines of all my colleagues. As Sanger made clear, the 1986 to 2022 honeymoon period was over. During that time, global arsenals shrank from 70,000 to a little more than 12,000. At its peak, the world had developed the equivalent of 1.5 million Hiroshima bombs. Freud was obviously correct. But with the end of the Cold War, much of the world was lulled into a false sense of complacency. Unfortunately, those days are over. As I mentioned, not only are all 9 of the nuclear powers modernizing their arsenals and making them more lethal, but several, including China and Britain, are openly expanding their arsenals. Others plan to follow suit. While the U.S. has not yet officially announced plans to add more nuclear weapons, congressional pressure to do so is mounting, and at least 2 congressional committees have urged the administration to do just that. Other countries are on the verge of going nuclear. Polls show that 70% of South Koreans want their country to have its own nuclear weapons. Japan, once the most anti-nuclear of all countries, is now only a screwdriver twist away from developing nuclear weapons, as it has announced that it's doubling its military spending. Article 9 of its peace constitution has already been consigned to the dustbin of history. If Iran takes the next step and does develop a bomb, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and others will almost certainly follow suit. Former IAEA head Mohammed al-Baradei warned that 40 countries have the technological capability of developing nuclear weapons. We could soon have the nuclear anarchy that Jonathan Schell, Dan Ellsberg, and others so passionately inveigh against. Sanger described Biden's nuclear employment guidance, which has been confirmed by top administration nuclear officials, indicates that the U.S. sees a nuclear threat environment in which Russia, China, and North Korea will coordinate a potential nuclear assault and overwhelm the more limited capability of the U.S. and NATO. They point to China's rapid enhancement of its nuclear stockpile, placing missiles in silos, North Korea's growing stockpile and steadily improving missile capabilities, along with its increasingly belligerent rhetoric, Iran's closeness to actually producing one or more nuclear warheads, with a breakout time in days and weeks instead of months and years, as it was under the JCPOA, and Russia's allegedly lowered threshold for use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine and other parts of Europe. In response, the U.S. is planning to fight and win a 3-front nuclear war. That same day, August 20th, Jack O'Doherty published an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist headlined, quote, "Is America buying nuclear weapons to win a war or to prevent one?" O'Doherty states that not all nuclear planners accept the widely held assumption that the only use of nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear war through the threat of mutually assured destruction. To the contrary, he emphasizes, there is a second school of nuclear analysts who believe the U.S. has the technological ability to preemptively launch a disarming first strike given breakthroughs in hypersonics, anti-submarine warfare, missile defense, and AI-enabled data processing. For the deterrence theorists, war between the superpowers is unthinkable. As Reagan and Gorbachev stated, and others have reiterated more recently, nuclear war is unwinnable and must never be fought. But there were strategists throughout the Cold War who rejected that kind of thinking. As early as December 1945, General Leslie Groves, who bore little resemblance to the warm and fuzzy character played by Matt Damon in the Oppenheimer movie, Groves advocated a nuclear attack against the Soviet Union if the U.S. had evidence the Soviets were developing their own atomic bombs. At that point, Groves still had control over the entire U.S. atomic arsenal and didn't need anyone else's approval to launch that attack. Preparing to wipe out the Soviet Union, President Eisenhower increased the nuclear arsenal from a little more than 1,000 weapons when he took office in January of 1953 to more than 22,000 when his budgeting cycle was finished a decade later. President Kennedy walked out of a briefing in disgust after being informed about U.S. plans to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union that its vast nuclear arsenal made possible. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, and before and after, General Curtis LeMay called for preemptive attacks against the Soviet Union, believing that the U.S. had the biggest advantages it would ever have, and it could defeat the Soviet Union and destroy its nuclear arsenal. In the early 1980s, nuclear planners in the Reagan administration advocated nuclear war with the Soviets, though acknowledging the U.S. would probably lose 20 million people. In 2006, Keir Lieber and Darrell Press wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, arguing that the U.S. had now achieved the first strike capability and could safely attack the Russians and Chinese, and neither would have the ability to respond. The Washington Post reported that the article sent head spinning in Russia with visions of Dr. Strangelove. So the fantasy of this current generation of nuclear hawks is simply the latest version of that insane and dangerous kind of thinking. Then earlier this month, MIT nuclear expert Ted Postel warned that this kind of thinking was spreading and incredibly dangerous because even the use of a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon would trigger an uncontrollable escalation to full-scale nuclear war. He further warned that Biden's new nuclear doctrine, based on damage limitation, may work in conventional warfare, but when you get to nuclear weapons, he said, you can never do enough damage to your adversary that your adversary does not have the option of causing the death of your society with even a minor successful response. He said the U.S. has at great cost produced superfused weapons to use in a preemptive attack on silo-based missiles, which would trigger the wider war. The most recent developments in Ukraine and Russia are particularly alarming, especially with Ukraine's August 6th incursion into the Kursk region, which Russia has been surprisingly slow to put down as it continues to make major gains in the Donetsk region. Zelensky has been striking targets inside Russia and keeps assuring the West that Putin is a paper tiger. That kind of thinking is now pervasive among U.S. war planners. The strike against Russian strategic early warning radar sites and other nuclear installations, plus the threats against nuclear power plants in Zaporizhzhia and Kursk, reflect the risks if this war continues. There has been more nuclear saber rattling coming from Russian military and political officials in response to these provocations, and the Financial Times reports that Russia's nuclear use threshold is significantly lower than previously believed. When you combine all of this with the fact that Russia deployed nuclear weapons to Belarus and has been conducting tactical nuclear weapons drills near Ukraine and nuclear naval exercises targeting European cities, the situation becomes even more dire. To make matters worse, the recently concluded Democratic Party convention in Chicago, which started on a positive, even uplifting note regarding domestic policy, ended on a hawkish bellicose call to arms against Russia and all of America's adversaries. I had hoped that Harris would strike a different tone and embrace diplomacy in a way that has been anathema to Biden in Ukraine and to some extent China, but I was disappointed by her and her party's unbridled militarism, as seen in presentations by Biden, Gallego, Panetta, and Harris herself, and her celebration of the lethality of American arms. Nor did she offer any real break with Biden over Israel and Gaza. The first Cold War pitted the U.S. and its allies against Russia and its allies. Proxy wars abounded in places like Vietnam. They were even more bloody than Ukraine and Gaza. When former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who is widely considered the architect of the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, visited my class, he told my students that he accepted that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war, 3.8 million. I thought that was a mind-boggling admission until I visited Hanoi this past January and was told by top Vietnamese officials that they now believe that 5 million Vietnamese perished. That was indeed horrific. But now the U.S. is engaged in a two-front Cold War against both Russia and China and their allies, and the line of battle is not thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia, but on Russia's borders. The new Cold War makes as little sense as the previous one. We were lucky during the Cuban Missile Crisis that it was Kennedy and Khrushchev in charge and not Biden or Putin, or we probably wouldn't be here today. As Kennedy said in his visionary 1963 American University commencement address, in which he called for an end to the Cold War, he said, quote, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. Or as Khrushchev said right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, peace is the most important goal in the world. If we don't have peace and the nuclear bombs start to fall, what difference will it make whether we are communists or Catholic or capitalists or Chinese or Russians or Americans? Who could tell us apart? Who would be left to tell us apart? Are there any leaders who think in terms of the planet today and not just their own parochial national interests, at a time when leading nuclear experts understand that the threshold for triggering nuclear winter is actually lower than Sagan and his colleagues projected in the 1980s? Even a limited nuclear war could send so much smoke, soot, and debris into the upper atmosphere that it would trigger a partial nuclear winter and kill billions of people. A large-scale nuclear war would effectively end life on our planet. But the peacemakers, with a few lonely exceptions like Antonio Guterres, Pope Francis, and Brazil's Lula, have largely vanished at a time when reason and diplomacy are more urgently needed than ever. We must end the madness in Ukraine and Gaza and peacefully resolve the conflicts in the Pacific, or by design or inadvertence, our species' life expectancy will be tragically shortened. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I think it's a good lecture for introduction. Now we have, so we already had Russians and Americans speak. Let's have Europe. Paul, you'll be represented Europe today.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm very. That's a good question.
Let's see what Europe has to offer.
Well, I'm gonna do an American perspective. The Europeans are caught in the middle of this, and in fact, rather than asserting themselves, they've come under the American thumb. So I'm going to speak to American policy and how it must change significantly to prevent exactly what Peter just talked about, because I do think we have the real danger of walking backwards into a major power confrontation. I guess you can't see me, so I apologize about it. I don't know. I didn't have a problem with my video before. I agreed with everything Peter said, except for one caveat. You know, when we speak of a honeymoon, you usually got to be married before you have a honeymoon. The U.S. and Soviet Union and Russia were never married. They never entered into a formal entente or alliance relationship as they had during World War II, as the spirit of Elba you talked about. This means that we were actually in a period of of dating, or what I refer to in my book as date rape. Very different relationship than a honeymoon, though we certainly had the image of a honeymoon between the U.S. and Russia throughout up until recently, at least until 1999. Now, I want to do talk about the peacemakers, those who were opposed to NATO enlargement, who recognized that NATO enlargement would destabilize Europe, would create a new crisis with and a backlash in Russia, new conflicts in Eastern Europe, and a possibility of a Sino-Russian alliance. All those factors were foreseen in, well, as late as 1997 anyway, at the beginning of the push for NATO enlargement. Sorry, I'm getting my... So we're really in a situation which was foreseen, in my view, I mean, at least in my first two books, Surviving the Millennium and Dangerous Crossroads, I talked about the possibility of major power war, but only if we could not bring Russia into a new security architecture in Europe. So first, I'm going to argue that there was a viable alternative to NATO enlargement. I was involved in the NATO enlargement debate for years, and they always said, oh, there's no alternative, NATO or nothing. It just wasn't true. The U.S. military had alternative plans to NATO enlargement, which in my mind could have worked through the Partnership for Peace. But the warning was launched at President Clinton back in 1997 when 50 prominent foreign policy experts, senators, retired military officers, diplomats, etc., wrote an open letter to President Clinton outlining their opposition to NATO enlargement. They warned that Russia did not pose a threat to Western neighbors and the nations of Central and Eastern Europe. The real danger was that NATO expansion would strengthen the non-democratic opposition in Russia and undermine nuclear arms control treaties that NATO would draw new lines of division between those who are members and those who are not, and would foster greater social and political instability. On the U.S. side, we would fret about the extended costs of NATO enlargement, how we push the European allies to spend more on NATO, and there would be the real possibility of a Sino-Russian Eurasian alliance, which was downplayed by Biden himself publicly in 1997. He didn't think it would ever come about. So the critics of NATO enlargement argued for a number of realistic options. I'll talk about the Partnership for Peace, but that could have taken place starting with the Clinton administration. Now, the Clinton administration was very pro-Partnership for Peace in the first term, and it turned against it in the second term and pushed for NATO enlargement. I'll try to explain that, so you understand where I'm coming from here. First, the critics were saying you need to open up the economic and political doors of the European Union. They got to get the Europeans in there first, not the Americans. You needed to develop the Partnership for Peace program. You needed to support a cooperative NATO-Russian relationship. You had to continue arms reduction and the transparency process, reduce nuclear weapons, make open lines so we knew where we were, so that each side knew what their weapons were, and reduce conventional forces as well. Now, the Partnership for Peace was the alternative to NATO. It was developed by then Defense Secretary William Perry. It was supported by Cold Warrior Paul Nitze, former Supreme Allied Commander General Andrew Goodpaster, former Supreme Allied Commander General Jack Galvin, among many others. In July 13, 1995, General Goodpaster wrote Bill Clinton a letter arguing against NATO enlargement. He said, the Partnership for Peace, which Russia has now joined, will, if made the future centerpiece of NATO, provide a much superior alternative to NATO enlargement. It responds to today's real security needs for Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, rather than bowing down to vague fears and historical enmities that would perpetuate past divisions. The partnership can allow Russia to be a full participant with a role appropriate to its situation and size. So it could constitute the basic security structure for the era we are now entering. Yet Washington and Congress never took any major steps to reform NATO in the direction of what can call political security, or I prefer to call cooperative collective security. The U.S. and NATO only put limited resources into the Partnership for Peace initiative. If it had been built up in the way as General Goodpaster argued, we would not be in the situation we are in now. So engaging with Russia and Eastern European security jointly was the path to go, and yet that was not the path chosen. So why did Clinton switch direction? There were a number of factors that led NATO to engage in its open-ended enlargement, which is a kind of absurd because it's supposed to be a defense organization, and it's being treated as if it's a club that anybody can join except for Russia. Now, Russia was given a very limited voice, but not a veto in NATO affairs to the NATO-Russia Council, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the following arguments were used to override the concerns of the critics of NATO enlargement, many of which, like Paul Nitze, had much more experience dealing with the former Soviet Union than most members of the Clinton administration. The first issue was President Clinton's desire to obtain votes and contributions from American citizens of East European ethnic backgrounds. He was fighting Republican Bob Doyle in the 1996 presidential elections, who accused the Clinton administration of dragging its heels on NATO enlargement, including the Baltic states and Ukraine. So the idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO was already there, even though the first wave of expansion after East Germany was only Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland. But the point is that Bob Doyle was pushing Clinton. Clinton wanted to win the elections and needed to come up with a formula because he was really supporting the Partnership for Peace in 1993, up until 1994. The next major factor was American defense contractors who were seeking new markets in Eastern Europe. The major lobbying group, U.S. Committee to Expand NATO, was under the Director of Strategic Planning for Lockheed Martin, Bruce Jackson. I met him many years ago when he was coming here to lobby. What was later called the deal of the century, the sale of Lockheed F-16s to Poland, was made in 2002 once Poland obtained NATO membership. Now, there was another argument going on, too, the neoliberal argument that NATO was not a threat to Russia, that NATO should help stabilize the newly emerging democracies and expand U.S. markets into Eastern Europe. Moscow could join NATO at some point in the future, but only once it had thoroughly democratized. So we had to wait for some sort of democratization process defined by who for Russia to participate in and work actively with and cooperatively with NATO. But there was also the neoconservative argument that the U.S. should seize the unipolar moment. Russia was not an immediate threat to NATO, and Moscow's threat to ally with China and other states was a bluff. But if Russia did become a threat, then NATO would be prepared as it expanded into Eastern Europe. Now, another issue which I'm investigating, have been investigating more closely, is the strategic consideration that in the period 1991 to 1994, the U.S. needed to press Ukraine to give up its significant nuclear weapons capabilities that it retained after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and therefore prevent the real possibility of war between Russia and Ukraine before the U.S. expanded NATO. So as I'll say in a minute, Yeltsin was shocked after he made the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 that Ukraine finally and Kazakhstan and Belarus all gave up their nuclear weapons. Suddenly, the Clinton administration was talking about expanding NATO right to the Russian border. I'll talk about that in a minute. German demands that secure a secure buffer around it. Why were the three states chosen? There are other states. There was Romania in the list. There were other states to join the first wave. Poland, the Czech Republic were the states that surrounded Germany. So that's one of the reasons why they were chosen. There was also the argument that the European Union, what was called the West European Union back then, couldn't couldn't handle the security issues, so they shouldn't go into Europe. It was NATO or nothing. Europe had Europe wasn't strong enough. Then there was the East European state demands themselves for protection against an unstable, if not potentially resurgent Russia. That demand gained strength when the Soviet, even under Gorbachev, was trying to repress Lithuanian and Latvian demands for independence in January 1991, and the attempted coup in August 1991 against Gorbachev led Eastern European states and people like Václav Havel, the Czech president, to seek NATO. And finally, the view that the Partnership for Peace would leave Central and Eastern European states in a limbo or a gray zone without adequate defenses, and that Partnership for Peace stood for the Partnership for Postponement of NATO enlargement, in Henry Kissinger's words. So Kissinger, Brzezinski were all pushing for NATO enlargement along with other hawks at this time, even though, as I tried to say, there were very powerful military actors who argued that the Partnership for Peace was a legitimate means to develop East European security. Now, the next point is that those who now argue, including President Clinton, that Ukraine should have kept its significant weapons capability left from the Cold War, were just wrong. Clinton, the idea now is that Ukraine should have kept their nukes, and this is what South Korea is arguing. They've been arguing for nuclear weapons, and that's why Biden's made a new agreement with them. Other states have at least pushed for nuclear, and I totally agree. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, then Turkey, then Egypt, who knows who is going to get it. But the argument was back then that, neo-realists make this argument that every state should be able to deter its rivals by retaining nuclear weapons. I find a very dangerous argument. But certainly, Russia, under Yeltsin, the pro-Western, pro-democratic Yeltsin, was threatening to preempt nuclear capabilities long before President Putin came to power. Now, he's going to do that with conventional means, but the idea was that Ukraine had too many weapons. They could possibly rewire them and therefore turn them into something that was usable. So in this sense, the Russia-Ukraine war today is a continuation of the very uncivilized divorce that took place from 1991 to 1994 and ended in that phase with the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine finally and reluctantly agreed to give up its nuclear capabilities. At that time, the Clinton administration worked very closely with Boris Yeltsin to pressure Kiev to sign both the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the START I Treaty. Kiev reluctantly did that and reluctantly gave up its enriched uranium back to Moscow and returned or had it transformed or had its nuclear warheads given to Moscow. So we had all these. On the one hand, you had Russian pressures and threats. On the other hand, you had promises of U.S. aid and investment to try to get Kiev to sign the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that provided non-binding U.S., Russian, and U.K. security assurances, not security guarantees. The term assurances was done by U.S. lawyers. It wasn't solid security guarantees in exchange for Kiev to give up its substantial former nuclear weapons capabilities. It was considered a major accomplishment for the Clinton administration, which also got tactical. They talked about loose nukes back then. The Clinton administration also was able to get some tactical nukes out of Kazakhstan, which was one of their big accomplishments. But what happened? As soon as they got the Budapest Manifesto, Yeltsin exploded in rage in December 1994, just having signed the memorandum. Yeltsin was angered by the fact that Washington was beginning to push NATO enlargement, what NATO itself calls a nuclear alliance. I argued at different meetings not to link nuclear and alliance together, but that's been one of the NATO's key points, calling itself a nuclear alliance, even though it claims it would get rid of nukes after a certain period of time. Anyway, the point was NATO was beginning to push into its membership into its nuclear alliance, into former Soviet spheres of influence and security faster than the Clinton administration had admitted to them. So in effect, just after Moscow had blocked Ukraine from retaining an independent nuclear capability through the 1994 Budapest Accord, Washington was already proposing expansion of NATO's nuclear alliance into former Soviet spheres of influence and security. Now, much as Washington was adamantly determined not to permit Moscow to deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba, there was no way Moscow would permit Kiev or potentially NATO to point nuclear weapons into the soft underbelly of the Russian heartland. Yeltsin's outrage in 1994 in many ways forewarned Putin's revenge in 2022. Now, the second term administration, after announcing NATO enlargement, did attempt to modify or bend the relationship between NATO and Russia through the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. Yet NATO's decision to go to war with Serbia over Kosovo completely upset the possibility of compromise over NATO enlargement. Just 2 years after Moscow had signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act in '97 that promised NATO would not deploy permanent troops or nuclear weapons on the ground to new NATO members, NATO engaged in its air war over Kosovo in 1999 against Russia's Serbian ally without seeking a UN security mandate or even even taking Moscow's point of view into consideration, and even talking to Primakov, who turned his plane around as NATO started to bomb. Yeltsin pleaded with Clinton not to pursue the bombing of Belgrade, as the Russian people would certainly from now on have a bad attitude with regard to America and with NATO, and yet he went unheeded. NATO's air war over Kosovo was seen as a violation of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act that had promised, quote, to define the goals and mechanisms of consultation, cooperation, joint decision-making, and joint action that would constitute the core of mutual relations between NATO and Russia. That's a direct quote from the NATO-Russia Founding Act. There was also the promise to prevent conflicts and settle disputes by peaceful means in accordance with the UN and OSCE principles, OSCE, Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe principles, yet US and NATO refused to work with the UN Security Council in the conflict over Kosovo. So these combination of factors, now combination of NATO's open enlargement, NATO's air war over Kosovo, combined with US support for Taiwanese independence after the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis, those factors then bring Moscow and Beijing together into a tighter Eurasian alliance with the signature of, on July 2001, between the People's Republic and Russian Federation, the 20-year strategic treaty. Now, my point is that the hardliners who proposed NATO enlargement really didn't imagine Russia and China coming together at that point, and Biden actually said that was impossible to do. So while there was, now what changed this situation though was the unexpected attack on September 11th, 2001, which actually brought Washington and Moscow into a closer relationship because it looked like they would cooperate in the global war on terrorism. And so just at that time, then NATO said, okay, we're going to meet with Russia on a NATO plus Russia format in the NATO-Russia Council and try to begin to get a greater dialogue. All right, so this did not stop, and we go on the this did not stop, however, being closer communication on the NATO-Russia dialogue did not stop the U.S. from dumping unilaterally the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It did not stop the Big Bang NATO expansion in 2004, where the 3 Baltic states were taken into NATO against Yeltsin's red lines and Putin's red lines. And it didn't stop the 2008 Bucharest summit from incorporating both Georgia and Ukraine into NATO membership at some undefined point in the future. Ukraine had formally declared itself as a neutral state at the beginning of its independence, 1991. That's the way that condition should have been formalized, as was argued during that time. So I'm going to leave it off there. That's pretty much, but let me just read one more quote here from William Burns. Then you've probably read this, many of you. February 2008, prior to the April 2008 Bucharest NATO summit that promised eventual NATO membership for Russia and Ukraine. Ambassador Burns, he was Ambassador Burns, Ambassador Moscow, now he's Joe Biden's CIA director, had warned, not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences, which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with which much of the ethnic Russian community is against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. And in that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to face. I submit to you that U.S. didn't sleepwalk into this war, but is walking directly into it. I'll leave it there. I have much more to say, but
No, thank you very much, Professor Gardner. And I think we do need to have a new term of sleep running into war at this
yeah,
point,
sleep
which it seems
running,
like.
good point.
uh, no, I think that all three of these presentations work very harmoniously together and are very, very great at setting up what I'm sure will be a good little dialogue process. We have about 45 minutes, and like I asked, for people who have a question for either one or all of the speakers, I asked people to put their names in the chat box, and I'm going to call upon people as they put their names in queue. Try, because we do have time as a limit, and there are a number of people who do want to pose a question or share a thought, to make your question as concise as humanly possible within reason. And again, direct your question to either one of the three speakers or all three if you'd prefer that. The first person who got their name in there is Anton. So Anton, shake and go for it. Oh, yeah, by the way, by default, everyone is on mute, and you have to take yourselves off mute first to be heard.
We go. Okay. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Ed Lozansky, for that terrific introduction, and to the speakers for pointing out the danger so dramatically. The United States and Russia have been partners for most of the time that America has been an independent nation. And this partnership has been in many ways at the center of world history. You could point out 5 little points where this showed up. Franklin and Russia in the American Revolution with the Russian leadership, Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II, both of them liberated the slaves in their countries. Then the Trans-Siberian Railroad was essentially a joint project of U.S. industry and Russian engineering. And then FDR and the Soviet Union versus the imperial system, as well as the imperial spin-off called fascism. And then John Kennedy's attempt to get out of this insanity of the Cold War and the danger there. The partnership is based on the joint common purposes of the two great nations. This is absolutely essential because the United States in many ways has, in our era, lost this purpose since the death of John Kennedy. It's based on a commitment to the intensive and rapid development of man's powers to improve nature and to give people better living conditions, and peace in the world, and to help the world escape from the Western European imperial system. Those 3 things have been the centerpiece of this partnership. Just to highlight, I only want to highlight and get your reaction to this. Kennedy was the last great example of this partnership. Kennedy was he emphasized the upgrading of the world's productive capabilities, the USA and other countries. He and his Glenn Seaborg, his atomic energy chief, were tremendous advocates of nuclear bomb disarmament and nuclear power development, both. Kennedy featured a full-scale industrial development idea for the USA and in many respects the rest of the world. That included nuclear power for desalination as a problem solver, fresh water, a huge project called NWAPA in the United States to solve our environmental problems by getting more fresh water, nuclear power desalination. He changed the Atomic Energy Agency internationally with Russia and with other countries to emphasized that joint nuclear power program. He was first enhancing steelmaking in the United States, make us more of an industrial power. And his outreach to the Africans, for example, was based on developing dams there with Ghana, for example, the Volta River Project, and the joint philosophy of the two countries has been based at its best on this commitment to improving man's powers. Ed Lozansky knows about this as a nuclear physicist, as a scientist, as a man who has participated in programs like fusion and other programs. And so this is our national purpose. We have been at our greatest as a country when we had this purpose, and it coincided almost exactly with this partnership with Russia. That purpose has to be revived, in my view. Otherwise, simply taking a pessimistic attitude about America or imperialism misses the point. America has to regain its positive influence in the world. And it doesn't have that influence today. The influence is based on our national identity as a great power and partner of Russia.
Thank you, Anton. I'm guessing you're throwing that out there. Would anybody like to comment on those considerations? Peter, Ed, or Hall?
I just want to maybe a couple of points. I would end with Kennedy, because as I mentioned earlier during my presentation, during the George Bush, with all his, of course, I don't want to admit all the problems that George Bush created, but still, it was George Bush, Senior, who said in '91, even before collapse of Soviet Union, that we are now entering the new era of security, our world security architecture, from Vancouver to Vladivostok. Vancouver to Vladivostok. This is George Bush. So simply, I want to say that, and I also mentioned this letter signed by 150 members of Congress, and Dan Quayle participation, all this stuff. So I would probably say that it didn't end with Kennedy, but extended a little bit with George Bush Sr.
Yeah, can I second that? Just want to add that the idea of the Bush administration, which I think was the right one, was to bring Russia into a new relationship with both Europe and the United States in the formation, as you said, of a confederation or a federation from the Vancouver to Vladivostok. But that was to counterbalance the rise of China. Now, that was not to turn against China. It wasn't to turn Russia against China, but it was to form a new, coordinate the U.S., Europe, and Russia to better balance China as it rose. That began to fall apart with the expansion of NATO, turning Russia right after the Kosovo War by 2001 to a closer ties with China. And that we now know that has become a really tight relationship right before the war in Ukraine. And that alliance has moved out not just to Russia and China, but to Iran and North Korea. And therefore now our nuclear strategy is targeting simultaneously the U.S. U.S. is targeting Russia, China, and North Korea, and Iran if it gets nuclear weapons. So my point is that the balance began to shift really with the failure to bring Russia into a new relationship with Europe and the United States, and as Russia tilted more towards China and forming this new partner, this very tight relationship with China. So that's part of the issue, and you have to look at the global affairs. And what's really interesting is that Russian-U.S. relations in the 19th century had begun to decline just around the time when the U.S. was reaching out to China, and Russia and the United States became competitors for the China market. Now it's a little bit different. Russia and the United States are competitors for being on good terms with China as China rises. So my last point here is, which I hope to talk about in a later discussion, is how to bring China and Russia into a new relationship with the United States in the future, because now we can't leave China out of the equation. We can't leave it out in the nuclear equation with the development of intermediate range ballistic missiles. We can't leave it out on other issues as well. So my key point here is just that we have to look at the big picture, and China is playing a big role in that.
Thank you, Hall. Peter, yeah, you wanted to throw
just comment briefly.
Yeah.
Hearing Anton Chaikin talk reminds me of why I voted for him for mayor of New York City 5 decades ago. I basically agree with the thrust of what he's saying. I'll first take a little bit of issue with Ed, because it was also Senior Bush who invaded Panama shortly after we were celebrating this season of peace, and it looked like the world was going to go in a different direction. We wasted very little time in invading Panama and then getting involved with the first Gulf War. So, and people often said the right thing temporarily. Even Jimmy Carter, at the start of his administration, talked about nuclear abolition. It didn't turn into a real hawk until the last couple of years. But I agree that Kennedy was our last great president, our last visionary, our last real advocate of peace and development in the White House, and that he and Khrushchev were working together in 63 and 62 and 63 to change the world. What happened was they both understood during the Cuban Missile Crisis that they had lost control. And late in October of 62, Khrushchev wrote a tremendous letter to Kennedy in which he advocated, he said, from evil, some good must come. Our people have both felt the burning flames of thermonuclear war. He said we have to eliminate every conflict between us that could cause a new crisis. And Kennedy responded slowly, but he responded in kind. And that's what they were trying to create when Kennedy was assassinated. And that's what his American University commencement address was about. And the thing that's interesting about that, or one of the things, is that he refused to allow the State Department, the CIA, or the Pentagon to have any say in that speech. He wrote it with Norman Cousins, and he wrote it with Ted Sorensen and his own ideas. And that's part of why it was such a brilliant and visionary speech.
Yeah, I'll just add an observation that I had made just to chime in quickly, that Kennedy's offer for a joint U.S.-Russian space program 3 weeks before he was murdered, I think, is something that people should also look at, as well as a sense of what could have been and where the world could have gone back then. And Khrushchev's son gave an interview that I just recently discovered where he said that his father wanted to accept that offer had Kennedy not been murdered, which you could only imagine how that would have changed the entire equation of mutually assured destruction that was really locking the world into a, everyone's knife is at everyone's throat. That's not a very good environment for creative dialogue and trust. So what a different world. And I mean, these types of lessons, I think, looking at the current situation, speaking to what Anton was also alluding to regarding the need to look for points of win-win cooperation, especially bringing in China, as Professor Gardner made the point, into the equation, is extremely important. So thank you, guys. It's now 12:30 Montreal time. I think we have about till 1:30 Montreal time, then it has to be a hard stop. We have a few more questions still from the audience, so we're going to go through this. As I said, as concise as possible, because I think everybody generally would like to every one of the three speakers would like to speak today to most of the questions. Stephen Starr has been waiting for a bit. Stephen.
Hi, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation to this important event. I'm a professor at the University of Missouri. I teach a class there on the dangers of nuclear war. one of the things that I stress in my class are the long-term environmental consequences of nuclear war, which I don't think have ever really been publicly addressed by the leaders of the nuclear weapon states, in particular the studies by Thun Robach et al. But my question is primarily for Peter, but anyone else who wants to address it. Something that's astounded me is that the whole idea of mutual assured destruction, which as you just mentioned, that seemed to keep Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States from destroying each other during the course of the Cold War. I mean, that fear was ever present, prevented proxy wars from expanding to the point where there's direct military conflict between the superpowers. But that fear seems to have just dissipated and vanished in the West, both in the United States and Europe, with all the calls for, war against Russia and weakening Russia, and the recent invasion into Russia that was a NATO-sponsored invasion. I think it's perceived that way in Russia. That's really changed public opinion, from what I understand, hardened it against the United States. So we're at a point now where we need to defuse the situation. And so my question is, how do we, I think the fear of mutual assured destruction might possibly be useful in this context, because it seems like the leaders in the West have just imagined that they can make Russia back down. Russia is weak. Russia has no red lines, despite everything that the exercises with tactical nuclear weapons and all the things that Lavrov and Putin say that try to discourage that idea. So how do we do that? How do we wake these people up? Is it because they think they can win a nuclear war? Dr. Theodore Postel has made presentations showing the development of the superfuse on the W-76 warheads that make them super accurate, and all those things that the war planners relish. But I just wonder, is that the driving force behind this idea that we can make Russia back down, or is it just sheer ignorance and hubris?
Well, Steve, you and Dan Ellsberg did more than anybody to alert the world to the dangers of nuclear winter, and you continue to do so. And I'm not sure. I mean, every once in a while, some of these leaders will pay lip service to that reality, but they certainly don't act as if they believe it or have internalized it. Even Biden had said effectively that even a limited tactical nuclear exchange is going to go out of control and cause a full-scale nuclear war. So that's why I said these people are insane, because even if, I'd like to be proven wrong. I want people to say to me a year from now, you were full of shit when you talked about the danger of nuclear war, because it hasn't happened and we're still here. But the problem with deterrence theory and with the current nuclear chicken that's going on is that it works to the point when it stops working, and then there's nobody left to tell them they were wrong. That was the point that Kennedy made during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the generals were all pressuring him to bomb the missile sites and invade Cuba. He said, these brass hats have one big advantage over us. If we do what they say, there'll be nobody left alive to tell them they were wrong. And so what is motivating these people to push in that way? Well, that's why I said it's incremental. So we delivered one weapon system, the first very, very minimal weapon systems, and we waited for the Russian response, and the Russians didn't respond. And then each time we got bolder and bolder and gave them the Ukrainians more powerful weapon systems. And it's Zelensky who's been saying very explicitly that there is no threat, that it's all bluster on Putin's behalf, on Putin's part. Well, maybe he's right, but the chance that he's wrong, and if he's wrong and the gamble doesn't succeed, then there's going to be nobody left to tell him he's wrong. And that's the real risk. So is there a guarantee we're going to World War III? No, of course not. Is there a guarantee that anybody's going to use nuclear weapons? Of course not. But there is a more than insignificant possibility of this happening, and we're pushing and pushing and pushing in ways that I think are irrational, self-destructive, and potentially uh, world-ending. So, uh, I mean, as I said before, you've done more to alert people to the dangers of nuclear winter than anybody, and we know, and I'm sure most people here know, that the calculations by Robach and Toon and the others recently that even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, could create a partial nuclear winter and up to 2 billion deaths. That's 100 Hiroshima size. We've got more than 12,000, and most are between 7 and 70 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. So even if a significant fraction were used, we're toast as a species. So that's why we have to get off this path that we're on. We've got to start talking. Putin has said repeatedly that he's open to negotiate. Well, we should call his bluff. We should see what he's willing to negotiate. I mean, it cannot hurt us to sit down and start this discussion, because we know that whether it's 6 months from now, a year, or 18 months from now, this war is going to end through negotiations. And, by that point, there could be 500,000 more dead or more than that, and the danger of this escalation. So why don't we get to that point as quickly as possible and use that? And Hall was correctly talking about the importance of China, which we've all largely avoided so far in this discussion. But as I quoted General Minihan, who said that he thinks the U.S. and China will be at war by 2025. We look at what the U.S. is doing to militarize the Pacific with the Quad, with AUKUS, with the recent developments between South Korea and Japan, and the war games with the United States, with Japan doubling its military spending, with 4 new U.S. bases in the Philippines, all giving us greater access to Taiwan, with the base relocation from Futenma to Hinoko in Okinawa. I mean, we can go on and on. This situation, that might even be more dangerous. It's interesting to me that when the Biden administration, well, they came into office, they had 18 top advisors from the Center for a New American Security. And those are the China hawks, not the Russia hawks. Their objective was really the Cold War against China. And even recently, when they had an opportunity to replace Wendy Sherman as number 2 in the State Department, the acting number 2 was Victoria Nuland, the leading Russia hawk. But they passed over her and chose Kurt Campbell, who's the leading China hawk. So that's really the main target that most of these people have in their mind. Rand issued a report called Avoiding a Prolonged War. Get out of Ukraine as quickly as possible so we can go after the real target, and that's China. Well, we can expand this discussion to include that as well, because we're as this new nuclear employment doctrine of the Biden administration says, we have to fight and be ready to fight and win a nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea simultaneously. If anybody's ever heard anything more insane than that, I don't know what it would be.
Yeah, that was really very eloquently stated. And I think what you've done just now, Peter, is you've sort of set the tempo for the type of themes that will be picked up in the coming weeks and months ahead. As this dialogue process that Ed launched is intended to be sort of more of an institution to really incubate and develop the fires of creative discussion, especially with this global chemistry in mind. People have to really exercise the ability to think global, think about the deep past, the deep future, and use that as context to vector into how to diagnose certain problems that otherwise are unsolvable if we're thinking about it from the standpoint of a probability theorist working with game theory models at Rand or something. They're just incapable of recognizing principled contexts shaping the decisions that they're acting upon. So I think what you've done is great. And again, there's so many trigger points around the world that are all connected to one process. What's going on in China's backyard, the Middle East Gordian knots, built on Gordian knots that could be also easily spin out of control. There's a variety of things that we'll be treating in the coming weeks. So I'd like for people to keep that in mind. And just a quick thought too. It's so ironic hearing what you just said, that so many Americans that I interact with are freaking out over certain types of propaganda that have induced them to believe that Biden is a Chi-Com CPC puppet, and they're being weaponized to support war with China, which is sort of not that different, but ironically, the same kind of formula applied to many Democrats who were induced to believe through a different type of narrative, but that accommodated their profile, that, you know, Putin has taken control of the United States, and you know, in both cases, good people are losing their heads to something which is neither, you know, run by Russia, run by China. There's something else going on that people aren't thinking about properly. So again, it's an irony that just struck me when you brought up all of the anti-China war hawks brought in by Biden's administration. I found that quite ironic. So I had to share that.
Could come in here on Europe. We're moving back. If you remember the Euro missile crisis that lasted from really 1979 to 1987, where the Russians were deploying their SS-20s and aiming them at Europe, and the U.S. decided to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles to counter those missiles. And the theory is this: if you can fight a nuclear war with tactical, so-called tactical or non-strategic weapons, the U.S. is deploying B-61-12 gravity bombs and integrating them with the F-35 combat aircraft. And in 2026, U.S. is expected to deploy the ground-launched intermediate-range missiles in Germany. So we're heading towards another Euro missile crisis with both sides. So why is that significant? Because the theory is that the mutual assured destruction will hold on the intercontinental ballistic missile dimension. But if you don't balance on the regional level, then you could have a tactical nuclear war, or a better term is a non-strategic nuclear war in Europe. And I mean, I think NATO was really lucky that it got through that Euro missile crisis. In 1983, we came very close to a nuclear war when the Russian radar systems thought they saw a launch of American nuclear systems, and the Able Archer crisis during the Able Archer NATO nuclear exercises. Russia took those very seriously, and really their military thought they were under attack. Fortunately, they had saner minds that realized they weren't. But my point is, that's what I think these guys think they're doing. They're repeating that tough guy Euro missile crisis where NATO won, Gorbachev backed down, and I'm not sure that's going to happen in this case. That's what I'm worried about. This is not going to back down so easily. Now, the other point here is it may not go to that point of a nuclear confrontation, but it's easy to start new conflicts elsewhere in the world. We already see Armenia and Azerbaijan going at each other. We could see Moldova and Transnistria. We can see North and South Korea. We could see a number of conflicts around the world coming out of this, whether backed or directly or indirectly backed by Russia or not, or China. So my point is that the next stage may be a widening of this conflict before it turns into a major power confrontation.
Ed, would you like to chime in on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, first of all, what happened today brings memory from my first slide, when we had academics who, advocated this idea of opening American University in Moscow. And today it's almost the same. And what I wanted to encourage those specifically professors who teach at American universities, or not only American, since we have, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have 24 countries who signed up. If they can probably allow students, we specifically decided to do it on Sundays so we don't interfere with the regular student schedule. We have to bring young people into this discussion. I recall when in my previous life as a nuclear physics and mathematician, if professor doesn't know how to solve a problem, he's asking his students, and the students can help to solve this problem. Well, this is true in mathematics. I don't know if it's true in political science, but at least I think we should try to bring students from all those countries to take part. And but I'm really pleased to be here for a good start. Thank you, all of you who joined, and let's. I think we're coming back again in 2 weeks.
Well, wait,
so maybe...
Ed, do we have to end it now? Because we did have a handful of questions still.
Ah, okay. Well, no, I'm sorry. I thought you wanted. No. Go ahead. Yeah. No. Yes. Keep going.
But your points are well taken, and definitely we all should think and very seriously about finding ways to get more young people into this process. I mean, it's a serious crisis. The next generation has to really be challenged to confront and work through a lot of these core ideas. So perhaps in 2 weeks we can increase the ratio of younger people below 50 as well to take part in a multi-generational dialogue. So yes, good point. We've got time for about 4 or 5 more questions, depending on how it goes. We've got Peter, Alice, Arseny, and finally Roger, who got their names in there. So we'll try to get through all 5 of those. Peter Jones, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to follow up actually on Ed's lead, because I'm an American who's a professor at a Canadian university and now in Mexico. So I've been a member of several peace organizations. I was involved in bringing World Beyond War into Canada. We actually hosted their conference in 2018 at OCAD University, where I'm still involved there. So there are different kind of peace institutions in the different countries or locations that we might be working with. I'd like to ask the panelists, and I think this has been really excellent, knowledgeable discussion with Ed, Peter, and Hall, that about what your thoughts and your proposals might be for the direction of a group like this, which at a size at about 50 could take some organizing steps among the academics and other professors and existing and perhaps creating new institutions. As someone who's been involved in peace movements since I was young, I've seen how some of the existing institutions, we're criticizing other global institutions that do not seem to be effective in the current crises, and earlier institutions established by academics, such as the Union for Concerned Scientists, do not show the priorities that we're discussing. And I don't think that they're moving in that direction. I think that perhaps a new type of network appropriate for the 21st century, that appropriately forms a scientific basis and an academic basis for responding to the propaganda that's being pushed by governments all the time. We need to have, I think, the kind of bastion of truth comes out of development in science and out of the arguments and discussions between academics. I mean, that is one place that we can work with. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the organizing steps that we could take from here that could lead to a more inspiring near-term and powerful organizing attempt from academics around the world that share our understanding of these priorities and the need for responses to our own governments.
Peter, Hall, Ed.
Well, I think this is what happened during this course. Well, I call it course because as university university, you have to have a course. So today was just introductory, I would say. We talked about history, and then now I think next session, which will be in 2 weeks, maybe we will have 2 weeks to think about it. I already started getting some specific ideas, and then we can hopefully start with those people who have those ideas. We can share. By the way, I wanted to ask if anyone objects, because we have about 100, over 100 people registered. I don't know, I didn't want to disclose emails without authorization. So if anyone is objecting, then I will simply not share this email. If you don't mind, then you can talk between yourselves. So maybe my next mail to all of you will be to see if anyone is objecting to sharing. But let's have at least, I don't know if Peter maybe or Hall will, I think Hall wants to talk about this next time. He split his presentation in 2 parts, history and then what to do. It goes back to Russian classic literature. To say, first you find out who to blame, and then you talk about what to do. So today, let's talk about who to blame. And I'm glad that Peter raised this issue of what to do. And well, this will be in next 2 weeks, unless Peter knows already what to do.
Well, I'll just make a couple comments. One of my frustrations over the years, having taken students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a study abroad class more than 25 times, and teaching and running the Nuclear Studies Institute, American University, and doing my big project with Oliver Stone, that I was glad to say we got the first blurb on from Gorbachev, frustration has been the indifference to the nuclear threat among students since the 1980s. With the end of the Cold War, we've been lulled into this sense of complacency that the nuclear threat is no longer real. I've seen this begin to change the last couple of years. Dan Ellsberg, in his last days, made a heroic effort to wake up the world. We had the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's annual commencement address, but especially the movie Oppenheimer. I remember going into one of my classes with about 40 students after the movie had come out, asking them how many had seen Oppenheimer, and I expected 3 or 4 hands to go up, but 80% of the students in the class had seen it on their own. And it wasn't a perfect movie by any means. The history was in some ways terrible at times, but it did raise the nuclear issue in an important way that got people thinking. What we've got to do is build upon that, because I see more questioning and thinking about this among the younger generation than I've seen for a long time, for decades. When I look at the people here, it doesn't reflect that. The faces I see are almost all older white men on the big screen, and that's not to say anything negative about older white men, but we have to diversify and reach more people and a broader constituency if we're going to be effective. What I've been pushing for with some of my colleagues is to try to get a global summit. I just think we need to get people to start thinking in terms of the planet instead of their own parochial national interests. And I think we need a global summit of the major leaders to sit down and start talking. We need to get diplomacy back again. Any groups like this or other groups we work with, I work with historians, and some of you work with scientists and other groups. We need to keep building them in order to create pressure on politicians and others. That's why I mentioned Guterres, the Pope, and Lula, because they've been the few who are trying to come up with solutions to this. And when I look at the others, Biden wants to make America great again. Putin wants to make Russia great again. Xi wants to make China great again. Modi wants to make India great again. You can go down the list. And I mean, they're all parochial nationalists with a very limited vision. And we've got to somehow mobilize the population to put pressure on them, because on their left to their own devices, they're not going to do it.
Paul, you want to chime in on that, or you good?
Simply total agreement. There are efforts on the part of Turkey. Erdogan's got his own issues, but certainly he wants peace in the Black Sea. China has, however, talked about negotiating, and Ukraine didn't say no to China's offer of a possible negotiation. Qatar, it was going to negotiate some issues about striking energy facilities. That fell apart, or so far as my knowledge has fallen apart. So there are a lot of states that could participate in what I call contact groups that help to put the end to the Cold War, to resolve specific regional conflicts and try to get a dialogue going among themselves and with Russia and Ukraine. So I think there is a way to work with the international community in doing that and pushing for a contact group approach that brings just a few states. It doesn't have to be work for the UN bureaucracy. That's a mistake. Working with states who have common interest in putting an end to these wars, the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Iran Hamas war, and the China-Taiwan conflict, I think, are my major ones to focus on. There are other ones, of course, but those to me are the most dangerous. Working to get states together who have specific interest in those things, those conflicts, and trying to figure out a way to wind them down.
Thank you. We have Alice, Tony, Arseny, and Roger. So we'll try to get through all four. Alice Slater, are you still there?
Thank you. I'm the first woman. I'm just announcing it. We're not only white Western, we're also a lot of men here. But anyway, I'm on the board of World Beyond War. I live in New York City, in the belly of the beast. And I'm so appreciative of the information and the background. The trouble is nobody in America knows these things. I mean, not enough people know this. They're totally lacking in knowledge. We've been assaulted by what Ray McGovern, who was a former CIA agent that formed VIPs, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He calls it the Mickey Man, the Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academic Think Tank Complex. We're in this fog of misinformation and attacks on Russia, on China, and supporting Israel's genocide. And I mean, it's just crazy. And I feel like we have to concentrate on my nation, the United States. Maybe we need a global approach, but we got to educate the people here. And we have a lot of talk about how awful nuclear war is. We know about this, but there's no talk about the solutions that have been on the table forever. Russia and China have put in resolutions to negotiate a treaty to keep weapons out of space, and the US turns that down. When Obama boasted with Israel about the Stuxnet virus that knocked out Iranian enrichment facilities, Putin, and the New York Times actually reported this, I can't believe it. Putin called Obama and said, let's negotiate a cyber ban treaty. We turned him down. And they put this into the UN every year. Not to mention that we walked out of the ABM treaty and put missiles in Russia, in Romania and Poland. And we keep nuclear weapons in 5 NATO states, including Turkey, where Kennedy removed them to get Khrushchev's agreement to take their missiles out of Cuba. They're back in Turkey. So nobody knows this. I think like the best thing we could do is like hire a high-powered PR company to put out like 10 facts you have to know, that if the Americans would do this, we would get agreement from Russia and China. They are willing to negotiate with us, but they're not going to negotiate from a position of weakness. They keep talking about their strategic security. If we're going to dominate the military use of space, they're going to hold on to their nuclear weapons. You know, I mean, this is how great powers play, and they've put a lot of offers on the table that nobody knows about, that the U.S. rejects and overrides and walks out of treaties, and we never even signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And when we finally did, Clinton gave the Los Alamos Strangelove $6 billion for subcritical and laboratory tests, you know, like they were still testing. And of course, Russia does whatever we did. It's always us. As a matter of fact, people should know that Stalin asked Truman to turn the bomb over to the United Nations, you know, when we were working against Hitler together and we were forming to end the scourge of war. And the first resolution at the UN was for nuclear disarmament. And we said no. So Russia got the bomb. You know, I mean, this is where we are with it. As there was a famous comic strip during the 50s in the Red Scare. We're in a new Red Scare. But it was Walt Kelly, and it was called Pogo Possum, and he had a line, "We met the enemy and he is us." And even though we're from all different countries here and different institutions and everything, I mean, somehow we've got to let the American people know that there's an option, you know, to change our government and take up all these offers. So I don't know. That's my thought about. Maybe this can be further discussion going forward, because I think it's time to stop talking about how terrible the bomb is. People are just hiding under the. We have to say what opportunities we're losing to get rid of it. That's the real scary thing. That there are all these offers on the table that the U.S. turns down because they're making a killing on killing. It's really like what Smedley said, the old general, that war is a racket. You know, I mean, that's what's going on. People are making money and they don't care. Anyway, thank you.
Well said. I would just throw out a thought that struck me before going to the speakers, is that one of the, I think the problems is that there's been propaganda for decades normalizing the idea of a dystopian future, and many of the people who have been immersed in Planet of the Apes type themes, right. You know, which is only amplified. Just look at Netflix videos or many of the Hollywood films that are promoted largely by Anglo-American intelligence, which approves and then puts money into various messaging that they want to be imbued within the psyche of the people. It all is based upon adapting to either accepting World War III type scenarios or adapting to a post-nuclear Holocaust. But it's so normalized that people don't realize how unnormal this type of situation actually is in reality, and how real healthy creativity should not be to paint pictures of this terrible future that we suppose we have to adapt to, but we should be thinking through, using our creativity, what are the solution concepts that we could be moving towards, like an asteroid just smacked into I think above the Philippines. You know, it was a little one, not a big deal at the end of the day, but really that's a reminder that, okay, if we're gonna save humanity, that type of power of the atom could be applied to do things that involve stopping asteroids. There's a variety of things to do, but we're not talking about that. People just are not accustomed to thinking on those terms. So I really appreciate your contribution just now. Peter, Ed, Hall, any thoughts?
Alice has been a stalwart of the anti-nuclear and peace movement for a long time. So just we're going to comment on one little piece of it. You mentioned about Stalin and Truman. Stalin asked Truman to turn the weapons over to the United Nations. Well, even Eisenhower did so. Eisenhower, the creator of the military-industrial complex, who later warned about it because he knew about it for having created it. Eisenhower and many others right after World War II, including the atomic scientists, wanted to get rid of America's nuclear weapons and prevent a nuclear arms race. And when they developed the Atchison-Lilienthal plan, Oppenheimer was the main architect, And Atchison, who was very hard-headed, said it was a brilliant plan and it's going to work. And it would have gotten rid of nuclear weapons right in 45, 46. We've had that possibility over and over again, and we don't choose that direction, as you know.
If I could respond,
Well,
it was my understanding, though, that Stalin didn't agree to it because we wouldn't turn our bombs over. We just said we'd stop making them. In other words, but they wouldn't have any look at what we would still have control of the bombs we made, or they'd be, and so he didn't, he wanted we get rid of all the weapons. I think that's what I read, but that's a good history question to find out what really happened then. It was my understanding that we turned Stalin down, not that he turned us down.
Alice, take a look at my Untold History of the United States book, because I go into, Oliver Stone and I go into detail on what happened. And Henry Wallace was the one who was most critical of the Truman administration policy. And he's talked about how unfair it was that the United States wanted Russia to disclose how much uranium it had, how much minerals it had, how far advanced this bomb program was. And then after we saw all their cards, then we would decide whether we wanted to play or not.
Okay, thank you. That explains. Yeah.
It's really a sordid story and a very,
I
very
must have read your
frustrating
book
one.
and forgotten it.
Okay, Matt, I think we're now around probably more than 2 hours. People are probably getting tired. So I think it's probably a good time. You have to apologize to all those, otherwise we can go on and on and on. This is a very interesting discussion. We can continue. In the meantime, we still can exchange messages by email and hope to see you all in 2 weeks. And I want also to congratulate Matt for those, he just get today promotion. He was just senior fellow of American University in Moscow, and today he became Dean of Political Science.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, that's I'm up to the challenge. Thank you for putting a new hat on my head. And no, I thank you for this opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where this conversation can go in the coming weeks ahead. So for those who don't know, in 2 weeks' time, we'll meet back here once again in this digital room with a whole bunch of other ideas and concepts. We'll have some expert speakers as well, just pulling on the threads that were raised today. I apologize for those who weren't able to pose their questions today, but the contact info for the speakers is available. Ed, how can we get the contact info for the speakers available so people who didn't ask their questions can write a message or something? Can that be done?
Yeah, sure. They have my email. Everyone has my email.
Okay, right to Ed.
And to me, and I will forward it.
Okay, and we'll try to get some more young blood in by in 2 weeks' time. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ed.
And Matt, will this recording be available to people?
Oh yeah. We'll get this up in the next 48 hours.
And what about the items that were listed in the chat? Will those be available?
That's a little bit more challenging, isn't it? Let me see what I can do. I have no idea how to do that. Maybe.
I don't know either.
Yeah, sorry. I'll see what
at
I'll
the
see what we
bottom
can
of
do.
the chat. At the bottom of the chat, Matt, it allows you to download it to your computer.
Oh, I'll figure this out. Okay.
Yeah, the icons at the very bottom.
I got icons at the bottom. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good.
Great.
Okay, guys.
That's great.
Till 14 days from now. Take care.
Great discussion. I'm sorry I couldn't be seen.